piece that I've chosen to discuss is the first movement of Paul Hindemith's Sonata for Flute and Piano. This screencast will include information about the composer, the context that the piece is composed in, a detailed analysis of the piece's form, and I will discuss the similarities and differences that this sonata has with traditional sonata form expectation. Paul Hindemith was born in November 1895 in Hanau, Germany, to very strict parents. At the age of 12, Hindemith began to play violin and soon became known for his beautiful violin playing. Around this time, Hindemith also began to study composition. Sonata for Flute and Piano was composed in 1936 when Hindemith was 41 years old for his friend and colleague Gustav Scheck. However, due to the Nazi regime that was present in Germany at the time, premiering the piece in Germany was forbidden. Instead, the sonata premiered in the United States in Washington, D.C. while Hindemith visited the States. Composers have used variations of sonata forms since the 18th century. In the Baroque period, the music focused on only one emotion and did not offer contrast within movements. When the classical period came along, composers began to add more and more emotional contrasts and ideas within movements. Because sonatas had existed for several years by the time classical composers were writing them, a certain set of expectations were attached to sonatas. By clinging to and deviating from these expectations, composers are able to manipulate and surprise the listener. Beethoven was famous for doing this. Composers gradually began to fall away from following the strict form and rather began to follow the general gist of the form. They wanted their pieces to be recognizable as sonata form, but they also wanted their pieces to be new and exciting. According to the University of Florida's Interactive Media Lab webpage, quote, "In contemporary music, the form no longer holds the same implications as before to establish irony and defy audience expectations, but composers still are able to find new context for this established form." End quote. The traditional and most basic view of sonata form is this. The first section of a sonata generally consists of the first key and first theme. The first section is tonally stable and cadences on the tonic. The transition section, or bridge, is modulatory, usually moving from tonic to dominant, or tonic to mediant when the piece is in a minor key. This transitioning section is therefore tonally unstable and does not usually contain memorable themes or material. The function of this section is only to smoothly transition from one key to another. After this modulation comes the second key. This section is usually in the dominant key, or relative major, and typically introduces a second, new theme. This section usually cadences in the new key. After the second key area is the closing material, which serves to reinforce the second key that was established in the previous section. The next section is the development. In the development, the themes from the first key area and second key area are developed through modulation, sequencing, fragmentation, and other alterations. The development section is harmonically unstable, and its function is to toss around familiar ideas that were presented earlier in the piece. At the end of the development, a modulation returns the piece to the first key. The section that follows the development is called the recapitulation. The recapitulation consists of the return of theme 1 and theme 2. However, the recapitulation is not the same as the exposition. While many of the same ideas that are presented in the exposition appear in the recapitulation, they are rewritten so that the recapitulation does not modulate to a new key as theme 1 would do in the beginning of the piece. This allows the piece to end in the tonic key. After cadencing in the tonic key, the piece moves on to the final section called the coda. The coda introduces new material that functions to end the piece. Now we will discuss how Hindemith's sonata both fits the traditional expectations for sonata form and how it deviates from the expectations. The first section of Hindemith's sonata begins immediately with the first theme played in the piano part, foregoing any sort of introduction. The piece does not have a key signature, thereby necessitating frequent accidentals. The tonic key is B-flat minor, but the tonal center is not firmly established because of the frequent accidentals outside of the key of B-flat minor that begin in measure 8. Beginning in the very first measure, the bass line moves chromatically downward for 4 measures until the flute enters in measure 5. In measure 8, we begin to see the first double flats, and in measure 9, sharps enter the scene. Measure 12 begins a short fragmentary modulatory phrase. This goes against traditional sonata expectation because the first key area does not stay in the tonic but instead modulates. Following traditional expectations, modulation should not happen until after the second phrase, but here modulation occurs in the second phrase. This makes the second phrase function as a transition before the actual transition, which begins in measure 24. While logically this should sound uncomfortable to the ear, it does not. The modulation comes across naturally without any distress to the listener. The real transition continues the fragmentary ideas and modulation from the second phrase of the first key area that functioned as a pre-transition. In measures 25, 26, and 28, we see both sharps and flats in the same measure, which adds to the harmonic instability. The flute and piano play through arpeggios that take the listener through fragments of tonal centers without firmly establishing a key. Arthur G. Brown stated in his article, Paul Hindemith and the Neoclassic Music, quote, Hindemith is entirely opposed to contrasts of key, and he has been called an atonal composer, giving an impression of vague or no tonality. It is said to be atonal. In reality, it is tonal, but the tonalities change so frequently and often in unorthodox ways that music is felt to be keyless, end quote. This statement can be proven true by any section of this piece, but the transition section particularly illustrates this, because rather than showing clear sections of modulation, the piece moves quickly through fragments of what could almost be identified as a certain key, but lack necessary parts. For example, in measures 24 through 27, the arpeggiated notes consist of only C sharp and F sharp. In the following measures, it is nearly impossible to tell whether the piece is in A key of C sharp, whether major or minor, or whether it is in A key related to F sharp, or whether it be in an entirely different key altogether. The flute part in measures 27 through 28 arpeggiates the notes C sharp and F sharp and ends on a high B. The piano part in measure 27, where the flute lands on a B, consists of an F sharp minor dominant 7 add 4 chord. This is definitely not a normal chord, and in a moment when the listener expects a moment of tonal stability after a series of arpeggios, this chord is very dissatisfying. However, it leads perfectly into measures 28 through 29, where the piano modulates downward in a specific pattern that, if spelled enharmonically, goes like this: half step, perfect fourth, major third, whole step, repeated 3 times. Following the transition, the second theme is introduced. The second theme is much milder and slower than the first theme. To the listener, this sounds like the calm after the storm. Rather than relying on fast-moving accompaniment, the piano part becomes sparse, with only whole notes, dotted half notes, and a few quarter notes rather than fast-moving 8th and 16th notes. This thin texture of accompaniment allows the flute to play with clarity in the lower register. It also adds a nice contrast and allows the listener to bask in a more tranquil setting. After the 6th measure second theme, we move into the closing material, which serves to reinforce the new key. The closing material is a very short, contrasting 3-measure section that sets an immediate juxtaposition to the slow tempo of the second theme that immediately precedes it. Rather than strictly reinforcing the second key, which is typical of closing material, the closing cadence of this section actually elides into the next section on an A major chord. The next section is the developmental section, or simply known as the development. The development begins with an immediate dynamic change, going from forte to pianissimo. Moreover, just like the beginning theme, it opens with a piano introduction, after which the flute enters. The developmental section of this piece takes theme 1, introduced at the very beginning of the piece, and alters it through fragmentation, transposition, and rhythmic alteration. An example of fragmentation is this. The first time that the first theme is introduced, the theme is played in its entirety. In the development, only parts of the theme are played in their altered forms. The listener can definitely recognize elements of the first theme, but can also recognize that it is not an exact repeat. An example of how the development uses transposition is the fact that in the exposition, the opening theme was played beginning on F, but in the development it is played beginning on G sharp in measure 49, beginning on B flat in measure 57, and beginning on D in measure 62. And finally, an example of how the development uses rhythmic alteration is this. The opening theme, which is first played on quarter notes and eighth notes, is augmented and played on half notes, dotted half notes, eighth notes, and quarter notes.